There's something quietly unsettling about the moment a government letter arrives and suddenly turns an ordinary habit into a question mark. Not a dramatic crisis, not some cinematic turning point, just a reminder, a small administrative instruction telling millions of people over 60 to check their driving license. And yet, for many, it lands like something much heavier than paperwork. Because driving was never just about driving. It was freedom, routine, identity, the ability to leave the house without asking permission, the feeling that life was still moving forward under your own control. And I think that's why this conversation has become strangely emotional in ways politicians probably didn't expect. What sounds like a technical issue about license renewals has started touching something deeper, something people rarely say out loud, a growing fear of becoming dependent. And you can almost feel the tension around it now, especially online, especially in conversations between generations. Younger people often look at this debate practically. If eyesight changes, if reaction times slow down, then surely regular checks make sense. That feels reasonable, responsible even. But older drivers hear something slightly different hidden underneath the policy language. They hear society beginning to question whether they still belong fully in public life. That's the part people are dancing around. Because aging, in modern society, comes with this strange contradiction. We celebrate longer life expectancy. We talk constantly about active retirement and healthy aging and 70 being the new 50. But at the same time, systems quietly begin narrowing around older people. Insurance becomes more expensive, healthcare conversations become more cautious. Technology moves faster than many can comfortably follow, and now even driving, one of the last symbols of independence, starts coming under closer scrutiny. It's strange because most families understand this emotionally before they understand it politically. Almost everyone has watched an older relative insist they're still perfectly capable behind the wheel. Sometimes they are, sometimes they genuinely are not, and those are incredibly difficult conversations to have because driving represents dignity. Taking away the keys can feel, to some people, like taking away adulthood itself. So, families delay the conversation, doctors avoid pushing too hard, governments phrase everything carefully, everyone senses the emotional weight attached to it. And honestly, that emotional weight says something important about the kind of society we've built. Cars became more than transport decades ago. In many towns and suburbs, especially outside major cities, driving became the infrastructure holding everyday life together. Public transport shrank, local services disappeared, communities spread further apart. So when officials tell older people to review their license status, they are not simply discussing road safety. They are indirectly asking people to imagine a future where their world may suddenly become smaller. The supermarket becomes harder to reach, friends become further away, loneliness becomes more likely. And I keep coming back to that because the conversation seems to be shifting towards safety statistics while quietly ignoring the emotional architecture underneath daily life. For somebody in their 30s living in a connected city, losing access to a car might feel inconvenient. For somebody in their 70s living in a rural town, it can feel like social disappearance. That's why reactions have been so strong. Not necessarily because people oppose safety checks themselves, but because many older citizens increasingly feel they are being managed rather than listened to. There's this growing feeling that aging populations are discussed almost exclusively through the language of risk. Risk to healthcare systems, risk to pensions, risk on roads, risk to public finances. And after a while, people begin noticing the tone. They begin hearing themselves spoken about less as individuals and more as logistical problems needing supervision. And maybe that's the point. Maybe this debate was never really about licenses at all. Maybe it reveals something uncomfortable about how modern countries struggle to think about aging with empathy and honesty at the same time, because there are truths here that coexist awkwardly together. Some older drivers absolutely remain safe and capable for many years. Some do not, pretending otherwise helps nobody, but reducing the entire conversation to competence tests also misses the wider human reality. The thing people are starting to notice is how fragile independence actually becomes later in life. One policy adjustment, one failed eye examination, one bureaucratic form completed incorrectly, suddenly a person's entire routine changes, and younger audiences watching this debate often underestimate how psychologically destabilizing that can feel. We live in cultures obsessed with productivity and momentum, so when older people begin losing forms of independence, they are not only confronting practical limitations, they are confronting the fear of becoming invisible. That fear sits underneath far more political conversations than we admit. You can see it in debates around healthcare waiting lists, retirement ages, social care funding, housing, digital exclusion. Again and again, older citizens are being asked to adapt to systems that increasingly reward speed, flexibility, and technological confidence. Driving just happens to be the issue that makes the tension visible, because it touches everyday autonomy so directly. And what's interesting is that younger generations may eventually feel exactly the same way. Right now, many people in their 20s and 30s assume aging is something abstract and distant, but societies across Europe are getting older rapidly, which means the question underneath this story is becoming universal. How do modern countries allow people to age with dignity while still protecting public safety? There isn't an easy answer to that, and anyone pretending there is probably hasn't sat through these conversations inside real families, because the truth is often painfully nuanced. There are older drivers who absolutely should stop driving and refuse to acknowledge obvious decline. There are also older drivers with decades of safe experience being treated with suspicion simply because of age itself. Both realities exist simultaneously, and politics struggles with nuance now. Public debate prefers certainty, headlines prefer outrage, social media prefers simple villains, but aging does not fit neatly into those categories. It unfolds slowly, quietly, sometimes invisibly. And perhaps that's why this issue feels more emotionally charged than officials anticipated. It forces societies to confront mortality in a strangely everyday form, not through hospitals or funerals or dramatic speeches, but through something ordinary: a license renewal notice, a reminder to check your eligibility, a conversation about eyesight. Suddenly people are not discussing roads anymore. They are discussing time, decline, control, dependency. The emotional undercurrent becomes impossible to ignore. And I think politicians understand this more than they publicly admit, because older voters remain enormously influential in many democracies. Any policy perceived as targeting their independence becomes politically dangerous very quickly. That's why governments tend to communicate cautiously around these changes. They emphasize reassurance, safety, responsibility. They avoid sounding punitive because they know how personal the issue feels. But there's another layer here too. Roads themselves are changing. Modern driving environments are more complex than they were 30 or 40 years ago. Cars contain increasingly sophisticated technology. Traffic moves differently. Navigation systems, digital dashboards, electric vehicles, automated features, all of it creates a driving culture evolving at extraordinary speed, and sometimes older drivers are navigating not just physical aging but a transport system transforming around them. That can produce anxiety people rarely discuss openly, especially among individuals who spent most of their lives feeling competent and self-sufficient. There is a particular loneliness in realizing the world no longer operates according to instincts you once trusted completely. And honestly, I think that feeling extends far beyond driving. It reflects the broader emotional experience of aging in fast-moving societies where change rarely slows down long enough for everyone to keep pace comfortably. So perhaps the deeper question isn't whether over 60 drivers should check their licenses. Of course they should. The real question is what kind of support, infrastructure, and empathy societies are willing to offer once independence begins shifting. Because if the only answer is restriction without replacement, then people will naturally experience these policies as abandonment, and that's where resentment begins growing, quietly at first, then politically. And you can already sense hints of that frustration emerging across wider cultural conversations. Older citizens increasingly asking whether they are still valued beyond their economic usefulness. Younger generations worrying about supporting aging populations while struggling financially themselves, governments trying to balance compassion with practicality, nobody entirely satisfied, nobody entirely wrong either, which is what makes this story linger in people's minds long after the headline disappears. Because beneath the license checks and administrative reminders sits a deeply human anxiety most people eventually encounter in one form or another. The fear that one day the world may begin making decisions about your life before you feel ready. The fear that independence can erode gradually enough that you barely notice it happening, until something official arrives in the post and quietly changes the meaning of ordinary things. And maybe that's why this debate feels so emotionally loaded, not because of cars, but because of what they represent. There's also something revealing about how differently societies prepare for childhood compared with aging. Entire systems exist to guide people into adulthood. Schools, universities, training programs, conversations about ambition and possibility, but very little prepares people emotionally for the gradual negotiation of independence later in life. So moments like this arrive abruptly. A license reminder becomes symbolic of a much larger transition nobody properly explained. And perhaps that's why these discussions often become defensive so quickly. People are not merely arguing about regulations, They are protecting their sense of self, protecting routines built across decades, protecting the ordinary freedoms that quietly hold together a meaningful life, because dignity is rarely about grand gestures. More often, it lives inside small daily choices: driving to see a friend, picking up groceries without assistance, leaving the house without planning around somebody else's schedule. Tiny acts of autonomy that collectively tell a person they still belong fully to the rhythm of society. And once you understand that, the intensity surrounding this debate suddenly makes much more emotional sense. Maybe the real challenge ahead is ensuring safety without stripping away humanity in the process, because people accept limitations easier than accepting feeling forgotten by society.